strange time in my life.
With your feet on the air and your head on the ground, try this trick and spin it. Yeah. Get hell of collapse if there's nothing in it and you'll ask yourself, where is my mind? Where is my mind? Where is my mind?
Well, here we go. You know, you know what we're talking about. So I'm very glad to see you all here. Welcome to Salon, MoMA R&D Salon number 57 about demolition. I'm Paola Antonelli, and today we have a new R&D fellow joining us, Alexandra Tell. I'll call her up here at the end of the day so you can meet her too. But you know, it's important to discuss topics that matter to us all. And we're all aching right now. We're all aching not only about the destruction, but also about the fact that we know that so much of the destruction that we see will be replaced by something much, much worse. And so that's why we need to talk about it today. We're surrounded by demolition, material, symbolic, political, ecological, and it's one of the dominant gestures of our time, if you really think about it. And yet, it is rarely examined with the same care that we reserve for construction, for rebuilding. So here we are. Tonight, we will sit with it. We will really think about it. And you know, across cinema, you've seen here Koyaanisqatsi, you've seen Zabriskie Point, you've seen David Fincher's Fight Club. Demolition always appears as spectacle. It is synchronized with music, it's choreographed, it is aestheticized, and the moments are there where the past is just obliterated and not questioned. And you know, architectural historian Charles Jenks, it's kind of a heavily architectural evening, I had to say. He famously declared the demolition of Pruitt-Igoe, which is the famous housing complex in Chicago that you saw at the beginning with Koyaanisqatsi. He said that that was the death of modernism. Well, that claim is debatable because modernism had already died many times before then, and it was resuscitated as many times afterwards. But what matters is the instinct to read demolition as an ending point. And there are similar points in Zabriskie and in Fight Club. In Zabriskie Point, the counterculture fantasizes about blowing up emblems of America mid-century domestic consumer life, like homes, televisions, and refrigerators, while in Fight Club, it's a fantasy of capitalism falling. And for all of us that have lived through 9/11, it's really jolting to think that that movie came out in 1999 because it was such a powerful form of iconoclasm. But history is really punctuated by examples of this kind of demolition to obliterate the past. If you think about it, Julius Caesar burned down the Library of Alexandria. The Spanish invaders got rid of Tenochtitlan when they invaded Mexico. Henry VIII destroyed countless monasteries, and the British demolished many of the Mughal centers in India, and then Algeria, Serbia, Syria, and even some positive ones like the Berlin Wall. So there are so many images that can go on in your mind of demolitions that were really meaningful to the history of the world. And today, this is what we face here. This is in our backyard, and it's our doing. This is an AI image that I prompted, and I'm going to read you the prompt. AI image showing President Trump demolishing the East Wing, the federal workforce, the Constitution, the rainbow, pedestrian crossings, birthright citizenship, immigrant families, NATO, and more, to the music of Vangelis for Blade Runner. So this is what ChatGPT gave me, which I think is quite beautiful. But it's worth remembering something fascinating. So this is Demolition of the Wall, which is a movie by the Lumiere brothers from 1896. It's an interesting movie because it was meant to be played both in one direction and in the others. It could be played backwards. So the wall would come back to be rebuilt. A wall falls and then rises again. And from the beginning, demolition and creation are entangled. Across culture, destruction very often is not an endpoint, but a phase. if you think about it, in Hinduism, Shiva is both destroyer and creator, the destroyer of ego, the annihilation of the self. And the circle around him represents the cyclical nature of being. In Norse mythology, Ragnarok, we're all fascinated by Ragnarok, ends the world so that it can begin anew. And in Buddhism, the wheel of existence, and not to mention Seneca the Young and the Stoics. So there's been this idea, which probably is a way to cope with death and to cope with the end of things throughout history, of trying to understand how the two can coexist. When it comes to economy, well, I'm going to move fast tracking to the 20th century, but economist Joseph Schumpeter in 1942 gives us a modern formulation, which is the creative destruction, the idea of creative destruction that actually comes from Marxism in a way, and the fact that the work that Marx did on the systemic disruption of capitalism. In a way, capitalism advances by dismantling its own past, and demolition is one of its engines and ways of being. And nowhere is this clearer than in real estate, as we know very well here in New York. This is just one recent example, a really good modernist landmark, the Union Carbide building by SOM, demolished to make room for a new building by Norman Foster, which looks like the Darth Vader Death Star, especially from the ground. And I like how Ollie Wainwright just said it, an eco-obscenity. Norman Foster's toroidal new skyscraper is an affront to the New York skyline. And there are many other forces at play when buildings get replaced in New York. Those of you who are from New York know that it's not as simple as that, but still, we see that happening all the time. And of course, this is what has prompted so many of our thoughts, even though the demolition idea of the Salon had been going already for a long time. This is definitely one of the most recent prompts, this idea of demolishing the past to make room for an uglier, bigger, and not better at all future. So iconoclasm, let's talk about political theater and iconoclasm. The Bamiyan Buddha that were destroyed by the Taliban in 2007 are really an example of this kind of iconoclasm. But you can consider also 9/11 a form of the same type of iconoclasm. The World Trade Center was our Buddhas, and they have been torn down in the same way. There are also other examples of kind of inverse iconoclasm. If you think about it, the 6 grandfathers, you see there those peaks in the Black Hills of South Dakota, were a sacred site for the Lakota tribes. And in the 1930s, they were dynamited down to become Mount Rushmore. And then they accepted the icons of the new regime, of the new way of being. So there are these forms of counter-iconoclasm. And of course, there are so many other examples of this destruction of previous cultures, as especially happened during the Cultural Revolution, the Maoist propaganda. This is a poster that is eliminate the 4 olds, establish the 4 news. The 4 olds are the old ideas, old cultures, old customs, and old habits to make room for new ones. So obliteration and complete annihilation of the past. Of course, all this is very rife territory for many, many artists. Here is an example with Ai Weiwei that famously has been prosecuted by the Chinese government for several years, dropping a Han Dynasty urn, a really precious Han Dynasty urn, to signify this form of iconoclasm. Actually, he had to drop 2 because the photographer missed the first one. So, that's the sad story. And then you'd be interested to know that Vietnamese artist Tuan Andre Nguyen has recreated the Bamiyan Buddhas and actually is installing them right now on the High Line. It's going to open any day. And the hands, which were never there, even in the original Buddhas, are going to be made using the shells. What is it exactly? Yeah, the shells of the shell casings gathered from the site near Bamiyan. So they are the shell casings that they found there. So it's a beautiful cycle also and catharsis that can happen. Well, the obliteration of the fabric of cities has been forever a form of control, of power, And Baron Haussmann and the whole changes of to Paris in the 19th century are famously about making the city more cleaner, more hygienic, more manageable. But in truth, there were also ways to make room for police to arrive everywhere in case of protests. Not to mention Mussolini, who in Italian, you say sventramento, which is literally gutting cities, from Brescia to Milan, where I'm from, but especially Rome, where he destroyed, between 1924 and 1922, he destroyed 5,000 homes, displaced more than 1,000 families, dismantled 5 churches, excavated the Roman forums in 11 months, to create this triumphal avenue linking his office at Palazzo Venezia to the Colosseum. Does that echo something that is happening not far from here? So look at Rome. These used to be really heavy fabrics, very thick fabrics that have been gutted this way. So modernism really was about trying to get to the idea of tabula rasa. Tabula rasa is like the clean slate. It comes from the psychology philosophy and John Locke. We're born as humans as plain sheets of paper, and everything can be built on us. And so it's the attempt in many cases by modernist architects to have the same kind of clean slate to build from. One of the great examples is Chandigarh. Now, Chandigarh was the dream of Prime Minister Nehru after the separation between Pakistan and India. But in truth, it was a boon for modernists like Le Corbusier. And even though the same did not happen in Brasilia because there was not much there before, in this case, there was really an obliteration of many ancestral homes, 28 existing rural villages, religious sites, and farms on 28,000 acres of fertile land to build this modernist utopia that we still revere today. We're in awe of what can be built over destruction, over demolition, and rightly so. But what happens when you get to places that are destroyed by the war, devastated, really more than gutted, killed and murdered, and then you get these kinds of proposals as the future, right? So what can we say about New Rafah and New Gaza that have been proposed by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, at the World Economic Forum as this kind of like utopian cities of like unabashed speculation built over the ruins of what used to be the Gaza Strip? Well, it's really this kind of world. And for those who really embrace the myth of moving fast and breaking things, it's like a perfect world. And you can see it here, move fast and break things. And it's a statement that could be read now 12 years and a glacial era later as pregnant with masculine energy. And it's the same bro-masculine energy that has led to this bromance between Javier Milei and Elon Musk that was consummated with the gift of a chainsaw. And, but who knows, right now, after the Munich security report that talks about the world entering a period of wrecking ball politics, maybe their next anniversary between Musk and Milei will be celebrated with a wrecking ball. So that will be their next engagement, plan. But this kind of ambivalence between admiring the idea of demolition and instead resenting it is something that we find, for instance, in this amazing small essay by Walter Benjamin, The Destructive Character. Benjamin at that time, 1931, was coping with the ascent of fascism, was seeing what Nazism was doing, and was trying to really understand how he could think, how he could put himself in other people's shoes and understand this idea of the destructive character. This idea of a young, cheerful, and methodical character that removes obstacles to create fresh air and open space. It's kind of sarcastic and really poignant to think about it this way in that really complex portrayal of destruction and demolition. In truth, even though he was provocative here, demolition can be cathartic, can be positive. You know, you might have heard about the anger rooms and the rage rooms where you get given very safe equipment to protect yourself, and then you can smash things to smithereens. Or, I thought somebody was saying something. Or instead, much more serious, but the rituals of collective mourning that come from tearing down places where some of the worst episodes of our communal life have happened, such as the Newtown School, or Parkland, or the Pulse nightclub. Sometimes you just want to burn them down to the grounds and forget about them. There are also ways to purify a place with art. You might remember here Kara Walker's marvelous Sugar Baby in the Domino Factory a few years ago. Roberta Smith on the New York Times wrote something beautiful. She said that she subjects a grand decaying structure fraught with the conflicted history of the sugar trade and its physical residue to a kind of pre-demolition purification ritual. And it really is what it was. This was an amazing sculpture that I hope many of you have seen. Similar, slightly different, but similar, much more humble, is this beautiful work by Amanda Williams that's called The Colored Suite. It's temporary works of art using soon-to-be-demolished homes on Chicago's South Side as canvases. And each one has a different color that comes from a register of African-American culture. And it responds to the urban planning failures of the redlining and the sorts of discrimination by making them really visible and kind of saying good riddance, before the fact. There's something also that is really important. It's the role of demolition in rewilding. That's also very important. You see here the Klamath River Dam removal. It's a removal of a dam that was not working anymore, but it meant a lot to Native activists to have it gone even physically. Or this, okay, these are my favorite pigs. This is a very lovely bucolic work by Isabella Tree in Sussex, in the Neb Castle estate that has been methodically given back to nature. And so these are feral pigs that I find the most beautiful in the world. And she's written a lot of books about how to rewild. So what else can be demolished? There are many different things that can be demolished. One is reputation, and sometimes it's demolished unjustly so. If you think of like Oscar Wilde or Pee-wee. No, well, I mean, Jane Fonda was never destroyed, actually. She made do with that. But, she had some setbacks momentarily. Don Lemon. There are some, Park Geun-hye, the president of Korea, that was disgraced by her talking with a card reader, not to mention Mr. Profumo and the scandal in the 1950s. And then, there are people that will never recover, and rightly so, like Weinstein or P. Diddy or Ye West, that now has been banned also from the UK, happily so. And then there's, I don't know how many of you caught this David Ross essay in the New York Times where he talked about being caught by the virus of reputation demolition that is the Epstein files, right? So it's really interesting to see what happens with that. Other things that can be demolished and rebuilt, this is something exquisitely American. It doesn't happen in Europe that you can declare bankruptcy and just demolish your debt and be started all over again. It's like unbelievable, right? And another form of fabulous kind of bankruptcy, but for good, is the bone marrow transplant. The idea of being able to demolish your immune system so that it can accept healthy stem cells that can rebuild you after you try to wipe out your cancer. So if you start thinking of this metaphor of demolition, there's so much of it. And in a way, maybe the best way to close this introduction is to think of an artist like Gordon Matta-Clark that really tried to think of demolition in a way to treat it as a metaphor for, he used to demolish things and call them unarchitecture, like demolition as a form of architecture and anti-architecture, to also kind of reprise the way in which we could think of the city and of life. Jack, are you here? No. Oh, too bad. Jack Halberstam wrote this beautiful piece, talking about Matta-Clark and the idea of demolition towards an architectural projects to restart this fluidity and this openness to diversity. And, you can see queer and trans politics moving them away from notions of respectability and inclusion and towards the anti-political project of unmaking a world that casts queers and trans people. The idea of unmaking is something that I carry with me all the time, especially the unlearning. I'm trying to work on an exhibition that deals with our relationship with animals. And it's really important to be able to demolish when we want to move forward in our understanding of the world. Well, there are really great experts to talk about all this today with us. And you'll see them here. It's going to be Francesca Rossello-Hammond. And you already have all of the bios, so except for two. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but Francesca Rossello-Hammond is the bulldozer lady. You'll see her later. Jody Graff is a colleague of mine from PS1. Christopher Lopez is a great photographer and educator. Vajanti Rao is a great anthropologist and a friend of architecture and design because she always keeps us really on our toes. But then there are two new guests that we had not announced because where they go, paparazzis follow. And those are Christine Cabot and Dini von Müffling. Christine Cabot is the Jumbotron lady. She will never, ever listen to a Coldplay song ever again in her life. And Dini von Müffling is her communications consultant and partner. And they will talk to us about reputational demolition. We will also have videos here by several local and faraway contributors, like Bajowo Collective from Lagos, Mona Hadler from New York, Søren Pillman from Sweden, Queen Slobodian from not far away, but I don't remember where, Dr. Sykes from New York, and Kate Wagner also from New York. I mean, we had some local ones. And so we're going to start right now with Francesca. Please.
All right, good evening. Thank you, Paula and Alex, for the invitation. Let's see.
Oh, you have to do the big
Oh yeah, the obvious one. Okay, all right. So building demolition peaked in the United States in the decades following World War II. Here in New York, we aptly associate this work with figures like Robert Moses, shown here. But by the 1960s, when 1 out of every 17 dwelling units fell nationwide, across the country, this form of creative destruction was a national phenomenon. It was part of what I've called a larger post-war culture of clearance, through which wrecking companies demolished buildings and earth-moving contractors leveled land at an unprecedented pace and scale. They did so to create what were purportedly blank or clean slates for new urban renewal development, suburban expansion, and interstate highway construction, among other uses. This culture of clearance was powerfully rooted in the preceding experience of war, and I want to talk about 4 key ways in which this was the case. First, World War II advanced equipment technology. Thousands of American manufacturers reoriented their factories for wartime production. They made tanks, airplanes, munitions. But for construction equipment makers, wartime production demands were largely compatible with peacetime production. For example, Allied forces deployed over 100,000 tractors during the war, equipping many of them with bulldozer blades to turn them into the machines that we usually think of as bulldozers, although technically it's just the blade that's the bulldozer. One of the most famous urban renewal developers once called the bulldozer, quote, the best invention we got out of the war. In truth, World War II spurred the development of no major new pieces of construction equipment, but what it did was hasten the development and advancement of existing equipment, like the bulldozer, increasing their speed, horsepower, and capacity, and making bulldozing both practical and cheap. Second, war trained an army of men to operate these machines. They staffed the Army engineers and the construction battalions, or Seabees for short, which were a new division of the Navy formed during World War II to both build and fight. Originally, the Seabees tapped men who were already trained in construction, a little bit older in age usually, but their ranks soon expanded to younger, unskilled soldiers. More than 325,000 men served in the Seabees during World War II. And when they came home, they brought their new and refined skills with them, staffing and starting many of the contractors behind post-war building demolition, land clearance, and construction work. Third, war effectively rehearsed and normalized practices of demolition, turning battlefields into proving grounds for post-war construction and destruction. Construction machines demolished buildings and cleared rubble-strewn cities, and depictions of this work, as in this ad here, often equated it with cleaning and rebirth. And we can see these outlooks mirrored on post-war American landscapes as demolition for urban renewal and highways proactively cut out the purportedly blighted and diseased cores of American cities to remake them anew. The demolition occurred in between these images. We often don't get shown the pictures of that, but this is the before and after. And the case of New Haven, Connecticut offers a striking example of this phenomenon. New Haven's mayor, Dick Lee, was so eager to showcase demolition that critics accused him of purposely leaving vacant buildings standing so that when someone came to town, he'd have a building to demolish for them. In 1958, indeed, he welcomed a crew from Life magazine, who in their subsequently published piece called him City Cleanup Champion. And this image really captures Lee's joyful participation in this work, swinging the wrecking ball himself. Of course, the work of urban renewal building demolition was nowhere near as simple as such popularly circulated images would suggest. Demolition produced massive amounts of rubble, the disposal of which proved difficult and costly. Other pieces of debris littered cleared lots for years, as it often took much longer to rebuild than to tear down, thereby imposing a new kind of blight on renewal neighborhoods. Although cities envisioned whole blocks to come down en masse, difficult relocations and legal opposition led to a more patchwork pattern of clearance, as shown in this photo. This slowed and increased the price of the work as contractors had to switch to smaller equipment. It even bankrupted many wrecking companies in the process. And for those who had to live alongside demolished structures, the pounding of wrecking balls damaged chimneys and parting walls and conscribed citizens to live in, quote, the fear and dust of demolition, as one person complained to the mayor. Finally, demolition wrought harsh social costs. Demolition for urban renewal alone displaced nearly 1 million families and over 100,000 businesses across the country by 1980. As in the case of the demolition of this Chavez Ravine home, these victims were disproportionately members of racial and ethnic minority groups. Now, imagery from the war and the early post-war period, though, positioned the work, the machines, the practitioners of demolition and clearance in a positive all-American light that helped to facilitate their popular embrace. For example, in the climactic scene in the 1944 film, The Fighting Seabees, Seabee John Wayne valiantly rides this bulldozer into battle. Although Wayne dies in the incident, the bulldozer carries on without him, crashing into it and demolishing an oil tank to create an explosion that sends the attacking Japanese enemy fleeing. Representations such as this one from Life magazine at the end of the war helped turn the bulldozer operator into an updated version of the American cowboy. At the same time, a new genre of children's bulldozer books also helped naturalize clearance by celebrating happy, helpful bulldozer operators and their friendly mechanical mates. You might think here of books like Katie and the Big Snow, I Want to Be a Road Builder, or one of my favorite titles, The Affable, Amiable Bulldozer Man, who looks really happy to be tearing down this building from 1880. Very satisfying, right? And I'm sure you can think of other titles. Alongside Tonka trucks and model toys, which also first appeared in these early post-war years, these books helped youngsters make sense of the rapidly changing world around them, while also reflecting the interests of the equipment manufacturers and contractors who sometimes also supported the production and sale of these books and toys. So as demolition and clearance peaked during the 1960s, their harmful consequences were also becoming increasingly clear. Artists like Gordon Matta-Clark, Robert Smithson, and others soon created artworks that portrayed demolition more questionably or critically. Children's books also changed a bit as well. And on everyday landscapes, Americans were now more commonly found battling against rather than with the once celebrated machine. Their protest helped to spur legislation like the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 and the National Environmental Protection Act of 1970. Whereas the post-war period had seen the introduction of substantial federal subsidies for highway construction and slum clearance, national policies introduced in the 60s and 70s supported historic preservation, environmentalism, and expanded citizen participation in the planning and use of space. And yet, as we well know, the demolition of homes and historic fabric and much else continues today. These reforms and the changing will to enforce them have helped to slow, although certainly not to stop, the often destructive progress of the American bulldozer. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Francesca. Now a video by the Agbajawa Collective, whose movie you might have seen. It was The Legend of the Vagabond Queen of Lagos.
The footprint of what was, a shadow of its former form, but still a home, shelter from the storm. The demolition is not yet complete, till fire burns belongings, the scraps of home, and we choose life and liberty over land. Illubirin, how many times broken and burned, but always rebuilt. Otodogbame dispersed, but not disappeared. A fresh restart, using the materials we can move. Dreams of permanence in place demolished. Home where we find ourselves, with those we love. Impermanence accepted. Did we ever have a choice?
Well, for me to answer that question is that whenever a demolition is being carried out without the mind of the people, it actually destroys their immaterial heritage. So their cultural way of living, what they does in the community, how they relate in that community. It's caused separation of families. It took away people's life, and I could tell you that there's still some families that are still squatting with their relatives. What happened in Chodoba, there's no remedy to that yet, and we are still facing other forces, a vision in our neighborhood communities.
Even hearing the word demolition, it causes a lot of fear in our minds, because then we know that we've experienced this in brutal and forceful ways that doesn't really benefit the people.
No stands to gain and no stands to lose. Of course, we the community fall victim of losing. Parents lost their child, and child become an orphan because they also lost their parents, and that's why we are here, because we do not want a such act to continue. Thank you.
Now I would like to call to the podium Christopher Lopez.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Christopher Lopez. And I'm an artist of Puerto Rican heritage, working primarily in photography, and within the last few years, working in public history as an archivist and oral historian. And the work that I'll be sharing this evening centers the subject of gentrification. Even more specifically, gentrification's proclivity to enacting violence as a means to displace and dispossess. And so for the moment of this occasion, on addressing the subject of demolition, I will share what I've come to learn, not only of the often insidious and nefarious nature of demolitions often orchestrated by profit-first driven systems, and their apathy towards good, hardworking, everyday people, but I will take this opportunity to as well speak of demolition too as a potential site of love. Love is the common denominator in many of the works I have created, and is often born from a place of rage. Rage can be a useful tool for artists who choose to not look away from destruction, but who choose to rather to lean into it. And so the enactment of love exists in myself, and surely each and every one of you, each as sites of some type of embodied loss. Loss, as often painful as it might be, as I hope to illustrate here this evening, can also be a site of fertility, of new growth and vision. In 2021, I began the Fires Project, a project that resurfaces from obscurity a history of violence and arson sparked by an aggressive gentrification campaign in Hoboken, New Jersey, known locally as the Mile Square City. In 2021, at the very beginning of my research, there was only one critical piece of writing on the subject of this history. Hoboken is Burning, Yuppies, Arson, and Displacement in the Post-Industrial City by Dylan Gottlieb. Between 1978 and 1983, nearly 500 fires ripped through tenements and rooming houses in the square-mile city of Hoboken, New Jersey. The blazes killed 55 people and left more than 8,000 homeless. Almost all of the displaced residents were Puerto Rican. Most never returned to Hoboken. nearly every fire investigators determined had been the result of arson. Before the fires, Puerto Ricans comprised nearly 40% of Hoboken's population, the largest per capita in the nation at the time. Today, they comprise only about 16%. The ongoing violence and subjugation of imperial colonial rule perpetrated by the United States against Puerto Rican people on the island, whether in the form of bloodshed through massacre or impoverishment through abusive taxation, would ultimately continue to follow us here in the diaspora. Demolition after the Pinter Hotel arson fire of 1982. 13 people would die in this fire. A different image they use here in this clipping. Renaissance, Reconstruction. These two things are happening in tandem. You have a Hoboken housing tour happening in tandem with fires happening in the city same year. You have ugliness like this. "I'm not from Hoboken," said one of the middle-aged men as he put lemon on his oysters. "I don't know what fire you are talking about. I was just thinking about moving here because of the closeness to New York and the low rents." Another woman said she hoped the tenement buildings would disappear. "I don't want people to be burned," she said, "but I wouldn't mind a nicer element of people here, if you know what I mean." The threat, the systemic denial. Even worse, things like this. Mayor Steve Cappiello admits that Hoboken has a serious problem with arson-related fires, but says he believes most of them are not motivated by profit. Deputy Fire Chief Edward McDonald agrees with him. Sometimes they're just started by mischievous kids. A lot of times they're just playing. But people still die, says McDonald, blaming children for their own deaths. Sounds familiar? Same mayor being celebrated, same year. He was also one of the biggest landlords in Hoboken during the time. A child's body being lowered from the Pinter Hotel. Paulie Rodriguez, a fire victim being treated at St. Barnabas Hospital, burn unit in Lyndhurst. Oh, I apologize. A trace of a child's drawing witnessing fire. As I began to slowly piece this history together, largely pulled from accounts given by the media, I began to realize how the silencing of this history came to be. The imprints of absence had revealed themselves throughout these scattered archives, and it became clear to me that what they needed was to be countered. This archive demonstrated how gentrification manifested in the city, but it didn't address how it felt. How is it then embodied? What is its afterlife? Who do these sites, absences, voids belong to? And how was I, or how do we as a society become accountable to the dispossessed, accountable to the dead? How then do we rectify these demolished sites, histories? In my work, you will rarely see a picture of a building or cityscape. I believe the story of a city isn't as much in its infrastructure or its pretty buildings, but is rather found in the people who activate those buildings and sustain the city through their labor and love, even in the face of having lost to those structures. People like the Tapia family, a family that migrated from Peru in 1972 that was burned out of their home. This is the last remaining thing that existed from their home after the fire. The Tirado family in Richmond, Virginia. Marisol Zenon, on return, this is the first time that she would return to the site of the Pinter Hotel building. This is the reconstructed building in the background. She came to return the names of her family. Janet Ayala, holding the last image of her mother at her home in Deltona, Florida. grief, on longing and letting go, ceremonies and practices, rekindling lost, estranged family connections. Sorry, I have to go through these so quick. I will just share that this is my project site, which I launched last year. There are 4 main parts to the site that I encourage everyone to come in to visit the site, thefires.org. It has a map which shows the locations of all of the major fires, a historical timeline, which begins with the city's redlining, its renaissance, and goes into the manipulative policies and legislation, namely the Vacancy Decontrol Act, that enacted gentrification and was largely responsible for the arson for profit campaign to be a viable tactic to deliver buildings vacant, the detailing of major fires, and acts of protest and disobedience. Evidence, which contains scrapbooks of newspaper clippings. These are all PDF files. You can go through every single page of that scrapbook, all 4 volumes. Police investigative boards. These boards are now in the collection of the Hoboken Historical Museum. The museum salvaged them from the garbage, even though the Hudson County District Attorney says that these cases are still open. These investigative boards were a part of a museum now. And fire records. If you can make it all the way to the end of any fire record, the city had delivered to them almost half erased. All of these things can be found on my site, of course, with the portraits and the oral histories. You can listen to all of the oral history recordings and read the transcripts. I encourage everyone to visit the site and listen to these stories deeply. Thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you, Christopher, very much. And now we have a video by Quinn Slobodian, who's a professor of international history at Boston University.
So I think in the despair that people understandably feel about the present moment, they often assume things about the current or prospective version of capitalism that catapults forward excessively towards some vision of absolute demolition. So in the work I've done, this has revolved around mostly questions of neoliberalism and now more recently Muskism. Neoliberalism, people often assume, means the desire to demolish the state, to do away with it, and to let market forces free to organize all of human life. But it's very important to see that even for neoliberals themselves, the goal was always to encase markets, never to set them free, but to make certain kinds of futures possible and others impossible. And that was done through statecraft. It was done through laws. It was done, yes, by rolling back some kinds of state, but also then by rolling forward others. So even those acts of demolition, even something like Doge, ends up being actually also about reformatting the internal functioning of a state to better make it integratable through market-offered affordances and services. This goes for Muskism too. In the book that Ben Tarnoff and I just published, we argue that Musk has never been a libertarian, no matter what people sometimes say, but his goal has always been one of state symbiosis. So even his acts of apparent destruction and demolition are actually forward-looking in a certain way, and they're designed to build out a kind of man-machine fusion, ultimately what we call a cyborg conservatism, but not one purely of anarchic chaos, but rather one of a kind of future-minded power.
And now I would like to call to the podium Vaijayanti Rao.
Thank you, everyone. So my talk is called Resurgent Ruins in the Shadows of Destroyed Worlds, and I'll mainly be speaking about my own research, which as an anthropologist has focused on India. To consider demolition, one must first consider architecture or an arrangement of entities in a perceptual field. While interviewing researchers from Hunarshala an architectural practice based in Western India, I heard how their documentation on rural housing had led them to a community for whom the house was a fundamentally shifting entity, where a room would be added when there was a birth in the family, and one would be demolished to mark a death in the household. Perhaps this speaks to something as close to universal as possible. For something to emerge, something else must die. In turn, emergence can be coded as resurrection, the coming back to life, or resurgence, something waiting in the shadows. Either way, the play of what lies in the shadows is present in myth and history alike. But the scales at which we understand history are much bigger, involving monuments rather than miniatures. We rarely think of the single home and the stories its cracks can tell at a world historical scale. That requires either the widespread destruction of multiples, of complete lived environments, and the explicit expressed desires to obliterate entire life worlds, or that of a singular monument to turn our attention to the morality of destruction, its causes and consequences. In India, for instance, the government schemes for providing free housing to rural and urban citizens requires the adoption of the simple functional concrete box in multiples. For example, this one is in a village where I did field work. And this here is, these are images from Mumbai. Demolishing and replacing the self-built home and its attendant cultures of building. The slow violence of these changes is overshadowed by the spectacular and seemingly sudden violence against monumental structures, once impregnable, turned to rubble and ruin. These acts of iconoclasm are invariably accompanied by threats and rhetoric, announcing intent to simply erase certain signs and secure their place as vestiges of a civilization past its sell-by date, but often as holy nodes of resurrection. Such was the case with the destruction of the Babri Masjid, a 16th century mosque seen in this image in northern India on December 6, 1992. The mosque, named after the first Mughal emperor Babur, had been a disputed site for decades, with claims that the mosque had been built over a temple marking the birthplace of the Hindu god Rama. The campaign to replace the mosque with a temple was the cornerstone of the then emerging Hindu right movement, led by India's current ruling party, the BJP, and allied organizations, including the World Hindu Council. On December 6th, a group of young men ostensibly gathered there to commence the construction of a temple dedicated to Lord Rama on the grounds beside the mosque, broke police barricades, clambered onto the mosque's domes, and took it apart with ropes, bare hands, and crowbars. Praveen Jain, a press photographer who was present at that day, testified later that this was not a random act of violence, but a statement that had been thought out. The day before the demolition, Jain had been invited to witness a dress rehearsal of the event of young men training to bring down the massive structure, becoming the only photographer to witness this event, and seen in this slide. The destruction of the mosque opens up a rift in time, a gap between two understandings of history, as that which happened and that which is said to have happened, a rift that then choreographs future action through an active silencing of certain voices and certain narratives. As in many other post-colonial states in the 1990s, including the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, the birth of globalization in India was accompanied by decades of ethnic violence, at first focused and targeted in specific riots and events such as this one, but later diffusing into what is being called bulldozer politics, routine acts of demolition of ethnic minority and urban poor neighborhoods to make way for luxury development across India. The destruction of the Babri Masjid in the 1990s also decisively pivoted the Indian state away from its developmentalist agenda of building infrastructure for food and energy security, such as roads and dams and irrigation canals, which also called for the overcoming of various monumental structures deemed to be vestiges of the past. Inaugurating one of India's early megadam projects in the 1990s, the country's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, declared to villagers whose lands were about to be inundated that dams were the temples of modern India, and the sacrifices of their ancestral lands and the monuments marking previous regimes would be the building blocks for that modern world. In the 1980s, the Srisailam mega dam, constructed over the river Krishna in the contemporary Indian state of Telangana, took Nehru's temples of modern India into the stranger terrain of having one's cake and eating it too. This is an image of the reservoir of the dam. As entire villages, humble homes, monumental temples, and agricultural lands were being swallowed up by the dam's reservoir, rendering thousands of villagers homeless and unmoored. The state's archaeology department set about salvaging and rescuing hundreds of monumental temples, such as these ones, dating from the 6th to the 16th century CE, taking them apart one stone at a time and rebuilding them on higher grounds. The ship of Theseus-like operation offered the tantalizing possibility of overcoming whatever negative energy might accrue to the state from destroying these holy relics in the name of progress. So this is a commemorative plaque, and these are some of the reconstructed temples. This is a before image of one of those temples and an after image, so perfect copies. In the 21st century, the post-developmentalist version of the state that was inaugurated by the 1992 demolition of the Babri Masjid, the storm of progress takes on a distinct market dimension. Under the guise of modernization as justice, we witness sweeping changes to urban land use, the conversion of industrial lands and various forms of dilapidated housing into new forms of real estate, conjoining architecture and finance. As Keller Easterling has written, quote, "The subtraction of buildings is as important as the making of buildings, and most buildings trigger a subtraction of some sort. As marketers, financial experts, planners, and politicians develop buildings, they also detonate buildings and landscapes," unquote. In this new universe, development and detonation go hand in hand, guided by a morality of usefulness, underpinning the design and mass distribution of spatial products. Here, usefulness goes beyond the work of just development, eradication of poverty, ethnic violence, and racial inequalities to serve trickle-down market economics in its missions of redistribution through privatization. The concept of demolition, then, is fundamentally evocative. It is never far from a shadowy other, whether that other is imagined as ruin, permanent and damaged beyond redemption, or as material capable of regeneration. Demolition may be as mundane as it is theological. From the medieval Kashmiri Shaivite philosopher Abhinavagupta to the contemporary Syrian artist collective Abu Nadara, the question of destruction is deeply tied to the appearance of matter and its speculative status as otherworldly, as manifestation perhaps of cosmic consciousness or of the divine. As Abu Nadara argued in their essay accompanying their film, The Image Maker, in the beginning there were ruins. Images materialize at the threshold of the invisible, emerging from the remnants of the decayed and the discarded. Annika Lenson and Stefania Pandolfo, the curators of Abu Nadara's exhibition, The Ruins We Carry, write that they're following the path of thinking about images in Eastern Christianity and Islam as manifestations of the divine. Abu Nadara asks, can images generated from ruins transfigure a world of division, extraction, and waste? Our engagement with these questions may be more urgent than ever today. Thank you.
Now we're going to move to different kinds of demolition and rebuilding, or predetermined rebuilding, with videos by Søren Pilman, who's an architect from Copenhagen, Denmark, and Mona Hadler, who's a professor of art history at Brooklyn College and CUNY.
what can architects learn from taking things apart? I think architects can learn quite a lot, and I think like people in general can learn quite a lot, because it seems like we all want to be deceived in a way, that we build in a way where the things that we see is not always how things are constructed. It's actually, I feel, more the norm, the opposite. So we built something that is easy and efficient, and then we clad it with materials that we like. And I would much rather like to see if we could create a connection between how we actually built and how we perceive the buildings in the end. Because I think it can lead to some quite dramatic change in our aesthetic preferences, which is a good thing. And secondly, if we really don't like the way that we built, then it also forces us to change it, because otherwise we will see it. So I think it's a good way to approach architecture and buildings in general. Just take things apart, and especially when you work with the existing buildings, because as soon as you work with the existing buildings, something that had a meaning for 50 years ago when it was constructed suddenly had a completely new meaning if you take things apart today, or at least it offers an opportunity for us to imbue it with another meaning, imbue it with another quality. So I think it's a natural way of working for my part. Always start by understanding how a building is constructed, how we can take things apart, and even more importantly, how we can reconfigure it and give it new meaning.
Yeah.
For several decades, starting in the 90s, I took my sons to demolition derbies and county fairs in northern New York. Cars doctored up for safety crashed into each other. Few, if any, contestants were hurt, and the crowds roared with laughter. Raucous, smoky, and reminiscent of war, destruction is offered to the public as play and consumed as such. The drivers generally came from the area and rode for passion, not profit. They laboriously refitted and readied the smash cars for the next match. One could say that planned obsolescence had changed hands from the CEO to the garage mechanic. The derby itself takes part in a repetitive cycle of destruction, reconstruction, and play that counters the industrial cycles of production and distribution. As to its appeal, there's a liberatory spirit of anti-discipline on display. The force of the individual spirit counters the force of industry. In a carnivalesque rite of reversal, the working class drivers symbolically transgress against the power of corporate America through playfully destroying and rebuilding its omnipresent symbol, the automobile. The wide popularity of the sport dates to the 60s, when millions attended the events. Indeed, destruction in both its playful and fearsome aspects was ubiquitous in the post-war era, from Tinguely's self-destructing machines to the mass culture of the atomic age. Think Red Hot Candies, for example. I have not been to a derby for many years and wonder how I would respond to it in the age of tariffs, oil crises, and MAGA politics, where powerful performances of hypermasculinity feel less carnivalesque and more deadly. Perhaps the lure of trauma thrills and crash humor, combined with the free spirit of anti-discipline and corporate critique, would still excite me and trump all.
Well done. So, and now talking about demolition and reconstruction and all these different layers, I would like to invite to actually the dais, Christine Kappert and Dini von Müffling, to talk about what happens when a reputation gets accidentally demolished and how do you rebuild it and pivot. So it's going to be a conversation between the two of them, which is a new format that I'm really looking forward to.
Are these on?
Yeah, it's on.
Oh,
You just
great.
start talking.
Okay. You can hear. Okay, great. So I want to say that we are very much last-minute additions tonight, and so we're winging it, just to be completely honest. I know Kristen because I'm a communications expert. I work with people who, some of my clients have really struggled with reputational issues. I've worked with Monica Lewinsky for 11 years, and I've worked with Virginia Roberts-Giuffre for 6 years. And I met Kristen in September of this past year. Is there anybody here who isn't aware of the Coldplay concert video? Amazing. So very unfortunately, Kristen was caught on camera at a Coldplay concert last July. She embraced her boss, who was single, as was she, but she was the head of HR at the company. And as a result, this moment went incredibly viral, largely because Chris Martin, who is the lead singer of Coldplay, joked, "Oh, these two must be having an affair because the man in this video ducked," and so it just blew up. Literally, the night of the concert, it just went completely viral. And just to give you context, this video and subsequent stories have been viewed 300 billion times. So that's wild and hard to fathom, but the net for Kristen was that she went from being an entirely private person who was a suburban mom who was driving her kids to school and had a job as head of HR at a tech company called Astronomer, to somebody who was overnight a public figure, famous for all the wrong reasons, and who then struggled with the aftermath of hate, which resulted in death threats, in vile comments, obviously online, in all sorts of trolling, her kids' social media accounts being duplicated, just unbelievable vitriol. And so when you and I first met, this incident, the Coldplay concert was in July, and I met you in September, and I said to you, "How are you?" And you said to me, "I got dressed today." Yeah, just to give you a sense of what that was like for Kristen. We are going to talk a little bit about the last 9 months and then where you are today. Thank you for having us here at MoMA. Obviously, media and social media can obliterate someone in an instant, as you experienced. What did that look like for you?
Yeah, for me, it was in less than 24 hours, my character and my reputation were decided by people that don't know me, by people that had no context about me, my life, or what happened that night. But millions of people saw a version of a story and made a decision. They judged, commented, shared, clicked, and I was demolished in the process of that. I do want to say I'm still very much in it right now. I'm still processing it. I don't have the reconstruction story fully baked for all of you. But what that looked like very specifically for me at that time was just a total collapse of my central nervous system, complete shutdown. I could not leave my home. I couldn't go out in public. Our home became unsafe because people figured out where we lived and wouldn't leave, and we had stalkers, and it was absolutely wild. And I just want to talk a little bit about, can I jump in here for a minute?
Whatever you want.
Just all this happened in a digital world where judgment moves faster than truth and evidence. This is something that I learned, and that reputations can be obliterated instantly. And the lack of care for accuracy leaves a permanent mark. So for me, I feel like I have some kind of horrible scar that I now have to work with and try to rebuild. I cannot erase it. It's online forever. This will follow me for the rest of my life. So I think that's something just to note that is new in our era now and in the digital era, that it doesn't go away. And I think that's something that people don't take enough care when they think about, or what they don't think. They don't take enough care when they go online and when they comment and when they forward. All of that creates this firestorm that turned into my life. And I guess when I think about the demolition, and I do want to say, Paolo, I hope my story is not a demolition and then a reconstruction of something worse. Like, I'm really banking on, it's gonna be so much better. Like, I am gonna come back from this, and it's gonna be even better than it was before.
I actually want to jump into that because I was having a thought while we were watching all this demolishment and thinking, oh, first of all, are you okay?
And it was weird watching those buildings collapse. I was told Deanie, I'm having like a physical reaction to watching this, which I did not expect.
But you know, something that you and I have talked about, and I'm kind of just throwing this out here without you really knowing that I was going to do this, which is that it it allowed you to reassess certain aspects of your life.
Yes.
And you know, we often are on a treadmill that we never get off of, and I wonder if you have a takeaway from that.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I've been working since I was 13 years old. I'm now 53. I found myself, and many people can relate to this, I'm sure, but I was a working mom, single mom. I worked in advertising and tech, incredibly male-dominated industries where I found I was the only woman in the room much of the time. And I was married to my work, my self-esteem, my self-worth to some degree. My pride was all wrapped up in my career and my achievement. And I would find myself, you know, making dinner and hanging out with my kids while my phone's here and the Slack messages. I think they knew by 2 years old, Mom, you have a Slack. And it was just, I was on this like grind, head down, achieve. And I wasn't stopping to really take in the important things around me in the way that I guess I thought I was, but I really wasn't. So for me, I feel like I was knocked off my path for a reason, and I was really knocked off my path. And loss of career in this was one of the hardest things for me to swallow. But I do feel like now I have the ability to take a step back and look at things differently. So there's some beauty there.
Yeah. One thing that I really want to talk about, and we have talked about a lot, is the role of big tech in what happened and how big tech makes a ton of money every time somebody posts a hateful comment or likes something horrific.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people made billions of dollars off of my pain, and that was a real eye-opener for me. I don't think people, in the conversations I've had subsequently, people don't realize that just by clicking a like or just forwarding something, that's putting money into those companies' pockets, and it's inciting and fueling the system, and it's creating this algorithm that is just continuing to inflict pain on the person that's the subject of whatever the story may be. And that was really eye-opening to see. I think the one thing I want to note just specifically about destruction, I know we've got a time limit here, and I'm trying to... Okay, because there's two of us. I thought we could get 14 minutes. But anyway, I do want to say, for the destruction for me, the demolition, it wasn't just my character and my reputation. And I'm not here for a pity party. Like, I made a really stupid decision and whatever. Like, I'm here just to say that it's not just a reputation that gets destroyed. There's so much more to it. So for me, it was, as I said, my nervous system was destroyed. My sense of trust and safety was destroyed. My ability to parent my kids through the biggest trauma our family's ever been through was not there. My ability to think clearly, to move through the world like a functioning adult. And my career, doors closed, conversations shifted, and that went away. And I think the impact it had also on my friends, my family, my coworkers. I have coworkers whose jobs went away because of this too. And relationships. A lot of people have turned their back on me that I considered really close parts of my network. So it isn't just slamming someone's reputation. There's so much more of a ripple there, and I think people don't realize there's a real person behind all of this stuff that's happening online. And just really quick to hit on some of the insights before we we'll go quick, then we'll move really quickly, 1 minute on the reconstruction. But it's the things I noticed, and this is sort of what Deanie touched on, the internet does not reward accuracy, rather it rewards speed and response. It also rewards certainty, cruelty, outrage, emotional intensity. And these are things that drive the engagement and fuel that system, like we said before. Judgment has changed. It's no longer passive. I've learned that people aren't just passively looking and judging. It's participation, almost like a sport. Like, so much joy was taken in this demolition of my reputation and character, and it had so much energy around it, and I was just so surprised by how much energy people brought to this. Disproportionate treatment, to me, as a woman versus the gentleman that was involved in the story is a whole other Salon topic I would love to tackle someday. That's a whole other thing to talk about, but it was really, really mind-blowing. And then we can, just 1 minute on Reconstruction.
Sure.
Yeah, I can go or you can.
You go right ahead.
I mean, Deanie is here.
No, you go right ahead.
For my, we've been partnering on, what to do now. And for me, and Deanie was so helpful for me, before I could do anything, I had to stabilize. I had to learn how to think clearly again, try to, before I could even think about my reputation, I had to get comfortable leaving my house. I had to get comfortable taking the punches, because I got a ton of punches outside my house, just in town and out and about, and that I had to get comfortable with people looking at me in an airport and a restaurant and talking about me and taking my picture. I had to separate my identity from the narrative. That was really hard. I never read the comments, but it was shared with me, a lot of it, and what was being said is not me. And that's not easy, even though I know that, but I didn't recognize myself. And when you don't recognize yourself in your life, it's hard to know where to start to rebuild. And then lastly, reclaiming authorship, and this is where Deanie can chime in, but for me, this is a lot harder than it sounds. There's a whole strategy to this that I did not know about, and thank God for this woman. But it's how do I speak, when do I speak, who do I trust to help me get the message out? For me, the choice was Oprah Winfrey, who was amazing, and the New York Times, Lisa Miller. And rebuilding is not a loud and deliberate thing for me. It was a tightrope, because if I spoke out, I was accused of seeking fame, and if I didn't speak out, I was guilty and hiding. So, we want to touch on that.
No, I think you did a great job there. I think that, as you said, you're still in it.
Yeah.
And just because you've been on Oprah, or just because you've had a feature in the New York Times, doesn't mean that this is over. No. To your point, we don't do a lot. We haven't been doing a lot of this exactly for this reason, which is we are speaking at a crisis conference next week, because we want crisis conference professionals to understand how to better manage a crisis. And we've been accused, and Kristen's been accused, of profiting when we're speaking for free.
Yeah, the conference fees are all going in my pocket, apparently.
Yeah, and as such, I think that we are still navigating how you move forward. You have been offered a job, which is great. It's like not the right job for you, but at least
dying to get back to work.
Yeah, at least that barrier has been crossed, because you had an incredible career before this and were so in demand in your field before. So we're going to get there.
I just want to say in closing, before we participate in someone's demolition, I think it's worth asking, are we contributing to truth or just momentum? Demolition does not require accountability, but the reconstruction does. And I guess the question is, where do you show up? So thank you.
Thank you. We're used to talking about our work at these salons, but not so much about ourselves. And so thank you for being so honest. This was not easy, I'm sure, for you, but it was such a gift for us. And I want to thank my friend Rachel Schechtman, who's put us in touch, because this was great. Thank you very much. So the next video is also about being born again, and it's by Dr. Megan Sykes, who's the director of the bone marrow transplantation research at Columbia University.
Bone marrow transplantation is a great example of demolition followed by regeneration and renewal. Originally, the idea of a bone marrow transplant was to replace the demolished recipient bone marrow forming cells to save people who had cancer and needed high doses of chemotherapy or radiation in an effort to eradicate their cancer. But it turned out that the bone marrow transplant was not only rescuing them from death due to loss of blood-forming cells that were destroyed by the chemotherapy or the radiation. It turns out that the bone marrow also came with immune cells that attacked residual cancer cells and actually was a kind of immunotherapy. So once that became understood, people realized that maybe you didn't need to fully demolish the recipient's bone marrow in order to get that beneficial effect of a bone marrow transplant. And so they developed kinder, gentler methods of preparing people for a bone marrow transplant that made it possible to transplant older people who used to not be eligible because the toxicity was too high. This approach also opens up new applications of bone marrow transplantation, like getting the donor and recipient cells to coexist to re-educate the immune system so that a donor graft can be, an organ graft from that donor can be accepted without lifelong immunosuppressive drugs. This is still experimental, but it's an exciting direction that came out of this recognition that regeneration and renewal of the immune system can be beneficial in unexpected ways.
Our last speaker, plus one video afterwards, but our last speaker at the podium is Jody Graff.
Hi, everyone. These are tough acts to follow, but here we go. I'm going to approach this topic by touching on a couple threads of inquiry that arose from my research into the history of community gardens in New York City, and this was research that informed an exhibition I organized at MoMA PS1, where I'm a curator, in 2022, and which I then expanded on in an essay for the last Chicago Architecture Biennial. Life Between Buildings, and you're seeing the hero image here, a work by Becky Howland from 1977, opened in 2022 and brought together works dating from the early 70s through the present day by 14 artists, ranging from well-known to emerging. And I'm not actually going to talk about many of these artworks, just a few of them. But through these works and archival materials, the show looked at the intersecting ways that artists and community gardeners engaged interstitial spaces of the city, vacant lots, gaps between buildings, traffic islands, in the artist Gordon Matta-Clark's words, the gutter spaces of New York, and engaged them through an ecological lens. Community gardens started proliferating in New York in the 70s, late 60s and early 70s during a fiscal crisis that left many parts of the city replete with burned down buildings and rubbled lots, abandoned by their owners and often foreclosed upon. Demolition, whether by design or neglect, set the stage for the community gardening movement. And this is the same kind of history of demolition and arson that Christopher was talking about in Newark. Residents in neighborhoods facing extreme disinvestment, such as the Lower East Side, the South Bronx, and Bushwick, began transforming these sites into green spaces. So on the left here, you're seeing what's kind of considered one of the first community gardens. It's debatable, on Bowery and Houston. This one was actually very much started by artists in the area. And El Jardín de Paraíso, a photo by Marlise Bomber on the right. So you can see the kind of devastation in the neighborhood and the garden cropping up here in this lower corner. Key for me from the very beginning was Gordon Matta-Clark, perhaps the paradigmatic artist of demolition that kind of kicked us off tonight, known for his strategically destructive gestures and concept of anarchitecture. So here you're seeing a work that he made for the first show at MoMA PS1 in 1976 called Doors, Floors, Doors, consisting of a cut the size of a door that went through 3 floors of the building in front of a doorway. So you would basically fall into it if you were to walk through that doorway. And he's well known for these gestures, but I was interested in drawing out a lesser known side of his work, his attention to the space outside of and in between buildings. In the mid-70s, he began a project known as Fake Estates. Alana Heiss, the founder of PS1, had turned him onto these surplus land auctions where the city, who was very eager to get any kind of land on the tax rolls, would auction off tiny slivers of land. And Matta-Clark acquired 15 lots in 1973 for between $25 and $75, including this 3-foot by 230-foot strip of grassy curb in Queens. And he was interested in these spaces precisely because their use and exchange values were so radically decoupled. Like he bought a square foot of someone's backyard that they didn't know had been sold. And, quote, "What I basically wanted to do," he stated, "was to designate spaces that wouldn't be seen and certainly not occupied. Buying them was my own take on the strangeness of existing property demarcation lines." What also comes through in this aspect of his work is an essentially preservationist attitude. By buying these slivers of land, he rendered them legally undevelopable. And I think there's many instances in which someone owns a tiny piece of property that kind of makes a larger development impossible. And this preservationist bent was closely tied to the idea of regrowth and rewilding. Here's just a detail. Oops. And the work as it was stalled at PS1 with work by David L. Johnson and Nilüfer Mamifar, which I don't have time to talk about. I had heard rumors that around this time in the 70s, Matta-Clark was involved in the early days of La Plaza Cultural, a community garden on the Lower East Side founded in 1978 by the group Charas. And they were a collection of Nuyorican activists who, inspired by Bucky Fuller, had started out constructing geodesic domes on open lots across the Lower East Side, such as these you're seeing here. And this is La Plaza Cultural in 1978, the year it opened. Many said that Matta-Clark's involvement in La Plaza was apocryphal, but I found that he did, in fact, help build the garden in 1977, though he passed away in 1978 before the project was completed. But he worked to prepare the space and build an amphitheater out of reclaimed railroad ties, as evidenced in these photographs, which I found through his widow in his archives. So here you can see the amphitheater that was built in another geodesic dome there. The garden was part of a broader project on Matta-Clark's part to open what he called the Resource Center, an environmental youth program for Lower East Side. Quote, "My goal is to extend the Milan experience," he had spent some time living with anarchists in Milan that was apparently very formative, to the US, especially to neglected areas of New York such as the South Bronx, where the city is just waiting for the social and physical condition to deteriorate to such a point that the borough can redevelop the whole area into the industrial park they really want, end quote. La Plaza remains a vibrant community garden, and this story follows a nice arc. Something was demolished, and a garden grew to fill the emptiness. To talk about gardens is to risk romanticization. They are the ultimate metaphors for rebirth, resurrection, the positive culmination of what may have started as destruction. But the politics around gardens were, and continue to be, if you look at a case such as the Elizabeth Street Garden, which is playing out right now, extremely complex and entwined in thorny questions of what is considered a tabula rasa and what is worth saving. This ambiguity surfaces in the work of Margaret Morden, another artist who is in the show, who in the late 80s began photographing the dwellings of unhoused people in Tompkins Square Park. When the city evicted the park's residents in 1991 and demolished their dwellings there, Morden continued to photograph and interview them as they dispersed to nearby vacant lots in the neighborhood. She documented the gardens they established there alongside the larger ecosystem of community gardens. In Jimmy's garden, on the right here, we're seeing Jimmy with his goldfish pond, which he filled from a nearby fire hydrant, and the city actually raised this garden just a week after Margaret took that photograph. And after raising gardens like Jimmy's, the city would sometimes turn the lots over to official community gardens. So 8th Street Community Garden, which you're seeing on the left there, was actually built on a lot that had been used by unhoused people, and they used the police barricades to make their planters. Morden writes, "There were complaints from homeless people, including a woman named Pixie, who had been thrown off the lot. The city, they said, cared more for plants than for people." Bound up, inadvertently or not, in efforts towards greenwashing neighborhoods, community gardens often fell victim to the success of such development plans once the land they were often essentially squatting on became desirable once again. When Giuliani became mayor in 1994, he began selling the land under gardens to private developers, culminating in a public auction planned for 1999 in which over 100 gardens would be sold to the highest bidder for unrestricted use. Gardeners and activists protested. I heard they actually released grasshoppers in the courthouse when they were litigating this, and they were met with derision. Quote, "This is a free market economy. Welcome to the era after communism," Giuliani is purported to have said. In the end, the New York Supreme Court halted the auction at the last minute in a case that was actually argued by Elliot Spitzer, concluding that the city had failed to prove that there would not be environmental harm. Nonetheless, many gardens were bulldozed. Oops. Here you're seeing Esperanza Garden on East 7th Street prior to bulldozing, during an occupation of the garden that was intended to prevent it from being demolished, and protesters actually lived in that large rainforest frog called a coqui, which is a Puerto Rican symbol of resistance. So they camped out there, and one protester was quoted as saying, "Robert Moses said you have to break some eggs to make an omelet, but we don't like the taste of this omelet. It's being cooked for other people to eat." And the garden was actually sadly razed on the same day that the court made this injunction on the auction, February 15th, 2000. The land had been sold to Donald Capoccia, a developer who proceeded to build an apartment building called, ironically, Eastville Gardens. I'll end with a cultural phenomenon that I think sums up these various notes and the tangling of these strands of demolition and regeneration and their symbolisms. As I was sifting through the archives of Green Oasis, a community garden on East 8th Street, I came across a stash of somewhat perplexing photos. In a tract of leveled land, leveled lots across from the garden, a single tenement building appeared and then, in later photos, vanished. A 1986 article by Sarah Schulman in The Village Voice helped clear up the mystery. In 1987, Steven Spielberg released a film titled Batteries Not Included, which you're seeing there on the left, the poster for that. A family-friendly science fiction flick, it tells the tale of a group of tenants living in an embattled building in an impoverished neighborhood, a thinly veiled approximation of the Lower East Side. Their building is the last tenement standing amidst a swath of rubbled lots. The film's plot hinges on the tenant's refusal to accept cash offered by a real estate developer in exchange for vacating so that he can tear down their tenement and build 2 luxury towers. Chaos and harassment ensue. The stalwart tenants are subject to increasingly violent attempts to evict them, but, and this is a spoiler alert, so I'm sorry, but the developer's efforts are miraculously thwarted by small sentient spaceships that show up, befriend the inhabitants, and start making charming improvements to the building. After one of the developer's henchmen blows up the building in a last-ditch effort to clear out the residents, the fix-its, as these spaceships are called, reconstruct the building to its pre-recession, post-war glory, sending the developers packing in an awestruck rage. Oh, this is very fuzzy, but this is the closing scene, and it shows the tenement sandwiched stubbornly between 2 towering skyscrapers, which apparently they somehow filmed this at the base of the World Trade Center and superimposed the tenement. That's what I heard. What you wouldn't know from watching Batteries Not Included is that the tenement building was pure simulacrum, all facade, a replica constructed on city-owned lots that were given to Spielberg for free. As Schulman wrote, quote, "Every day the crew is out on scaffolds busily pasting paper strips of fake old brick onto the structure's plywood facade, while the real empty shells of abandoned buildings loom in the background for atmosphere." So you're seeing it being constructed across from the garden there, and then its kind of finished facade on the right. In order to ensure that the neighborhood looked adequately desolate, the crew brought in extra rubble for the lot. They also asked Green Oasis if they could bulldoze the garden because it tempered the look of devastation that they were after. Rebuffed by the gardeners, Spielberg agreed to pay Green Oasis to erect plywood barriers around the garden, which you're seeing on the right, hired people to paint fake graffiti on them, and trimmed the tops of the garden's ailanthus trees so that they were hidden behind the fence. Purpose-built for its own demolition, the Batteries Not Included building was blown up by the film crew at 5 o'clock one morning, which I think was very surprising for a lot of people in the neighborhood. Its demise offered a dramatic restaging of the actual landlord neglect and arson that riddled the neighborhood at the time. It was also a rehearsal for the gentrification that was beginning to happen. In reality, the lot ended up being developed, no aliens came to the rescue, and Green Oasis, somewhat miraculously, kept on growing and is still there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. So our last video is Kate Wagner, architecture critic of the nation.
For better or for worse, demolition has the power to deliver a shock to the system, serves as a wake-up call for the way things are going, and ideally the way they should be instead. Perhaps the most dramatic and upsetting case of demolition right now is Donald Trump's malevolent and at present disastrous demolition of the East Wing of the White House, upon whose site he is supposed to be constructing a ballroom. The implications of this seem immediately obvious. The destruction of one of the most enduring symbols of the United States, both as a democratic country and as an extremely fraught one, and its replacement with what is essentially an imperialist bauble in the old mode, including its McMansionized faux classical aesthetic palette in which lords of industry, crypto scammers, and debased culture warriors, and the like can assemble and decide the fate of the American people. It marks a grim future for a nation already in decline. That being said, the sacralizing of the White House, so prominent in most writings about the subject, occludes a different reality. One demolition brings to light, which is that the people's house has never really been for the people. Built by slaves for slaveholders, it is the central node from which all the misery of American imperialism, interventionism, and adventurism emanates. For many in the world, it is actually a site of despotism, and the ugliness of what Trump is doing is actually something that's just coming home to roost. It has always been lurking beneath the surface. There have always been two countries, one for the wealthy and powerful and one for everyone else. And this is a divide more extreme here than it is anywhere else in the world, and that is a world that arguably must be demolished. What is deeply upsetting to me, actually, is the fact that only the right has organized power and the desire to reshape the world in a certain cohesive, if very unpleasant, aesthetic image. The demolition of the East Wing is as much about real power as it is about architectural symbol making. It forces us on the other side of the divide to ask questions about what we would do instead, how we could change the world in our image, and what that image even is. And so for all that is lamentable and destructive in this act, there is also so much that should be generative rather than just lamentable. And so one of the subtle truths of demolition is the fact that the history only ever moves forward. There is literally no returning to the world where that building is still there. And so really, the time to mourn must be over. The building has been torn down, but the time to organize is always upon us.
So I would like now to invite the speakers to sit here wherever you want. There's water for you under the seats. And there's one question that I want to pose to you all, and you can think about it. And while we just go around, Christopher, come here. And while we go around, while I ask other questions, you can think about it. So to all the speakers, is there one thing, place, idea, norm, system, etc., that you would like to see demolished? Okay, so well, you think about it. In the meantime, I'm going to ask other questions. I wanted to start with Vajenti because one thing that we didn't talk about is the fact that you're also curating the Sharjah Triennial this year in November, and you're doing it. Yeah, I know. The Architecture Triennial, and it's kind of a difficult situation right now. You haven't been able to go to the Gulf in a while, and you don't know what you're going to find there. But so you're dealing with a lot of demolition. So how are you dealing with it? How's your life going right now as a curator of Sharjah? Mm-hmm. You just talk, yes.
Yeah, I think, in fact, I returned from my last trip to Sharjah in February, maybe 2.5 weeks before the world changed. And it was obviously quite a shock because, especially for the UAE, which had wagered itself at, in a very delicate position in between all these superpowers. So in terms of how's it going, I think it's tough to say, but one of the things that I've been remotely observing is something quite interesting. In the UAE, as you know, a country that comprises more immigrants than natives, so to speak. And so I think it's been a very interesting moment to think about how this kind of configuration works in a moment when everyone is under siege. How does a place become hospitable to people who are there to make their lives through work? And how does it become an actual place of coming together of many different nationalities and people? And I think we're witnessing that happening, actually.
Very interesting side. And Francesca, one for you. So tonight we talked about cities, about urban demolition, but because of your research on the bulldozer, on this icon of not only Americanness, but all over the world, the bulldozer is adored and revered. But what about instead the demolition of natural landscapes? Because you also talked about that in your research.
Yeah, that's. I really see that as a dual phenomenon that came to rise at this moment. The bulldozer demolishes everything, right? Forests, mountains, buildings. There is this fascination about clearing away and creating these opportunities to build anew. And you had the same resistance, I think the environmental movement and also the movement that resisted urban renewal, they were both pushing back against this same thing, this clearance, demolition, clearance, and the power and the might of pushing everything away. And both of those things were being displaced. Urban renewal, often in cities, so buildings were coming down, but for the creation of suburbs and highways, more often than not, it was the clearance of land. And they were really parallel processes. It didn't just happen because people were excited about it, it was funded, right? We had certain federal policies in place at the time that incentivized this. Urban renewal, the federal government would pay 2/3 of the cost of acquiring and clearing land. The funding for the highways was 90% from the federal government, such that states would create new ones instead of repairing old ones, because that's what the money was for, and that required the removal of earth. Also, the tax incentives of greenfield development versus maintaining what you have. So it's not just an idea, and it's not just a technological capability, it's following the money and what the incentives are and how policy can actually realize ideas that have always been out there and make them much more actionable. So they're all part of the same story, I think.
Yeah, it's a system. That's what happens also in Manhattan. Sometimes it's more convenient to demolish and rebuild, and it's really interesting. It's like, sad. So Christopher, I remember seeing this documentary called War Photographer. It was James Natwig. It was really amazing because it showed how sometimes when you go to people in the worst moments of their lives and you just put the microphone in front of them or the camera in front of them, they just are happy to be given a voice. So you not only documented with archival research and photography, but also you gathered a lot of oral histories. How was that experience?
Hello. Yeah, oral history is a big part of the project and my work and my practice now. Working in oral history, for me, really is about sort of creating a space for people to be just acknowledgement. I'm really big on acknowledgement. And so when I work with my subject or when I meet people for the very first time, it's really important for me to sort of just begin the process of sort of being in common with them and just sharing space with them. And sort of we just talk about everything and anything. And it's really interesting that when you begin from this common place, sort of how people have the ability to have this sort of full circle moment, the things that come from how's your day, how are you, what'd you have for breakfast, the weather, these common things. Life, right? And sort of gives them the ability, they know the reason I'm here, like we're here to talk about the fires, right? But I don't ask that question outright, just like who does it serve? Like what is that? You know what I'm saying? So it's like in speaking about their present, they're able to come full circle and sort of make these really strong and poignant connections about those events and that past that can be very illuminating and important for us to hear and know. So yeah, oral history is tremendous, and oftentimes when I'm working with anyone, I do so for several months or sometimes even several years. It's the same thing with photography. Sometimes it's taken almost 2 years just to make a single image because we're in conversation with each other for that long of time.
Thank you. Well, some crises are long in the making and some instead are sudden and unexpected, like what happened to you, Kristen. And you were talking about the fact that the acceleration that is provided, it's really like a fire accelerant by social media is really devastating. So I'm asking you, and I'm asking Dini also, because you've been so long in this business, how different is it to try and rebuild a reputation right now as opposed to like 10 years ago? And when do you know that it's time to rebuild? That's for, so the first part is for Dini, and so, go ahead.
Just an anecdote I wanted to share. I didn't have time earlier, but Daryl Hannah wrote an essay in the New York Times regarding the way she was portrayed in Love Story, which is the John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette story, and Daryl Hannah had a relationship with him, and she made a comment. When I read it, I was shook. Like it really resonated with me and my experience, but she made the comment that Jackie Onassis Kennedy had at some point sat her down and said, "Don't worry what the news says about you. Newspapers will be lining bird cages in the morning, and people will forget about it and on to the next thing." And her point was now, things are indelible with social media and with the internet, so it's completely different. It doesn't go away. And I'll kind of hand it over to you, but that was the thing that's scariest for me is like, I got to figure out how to carry this with me forever and rebuild in spite of that. And in the, 80s and even 90s, that still wasn't, some of the part of the 90s wasn't the case. You throw out the paper and the next day and on to the next. But
I'm going to take a little bit of a different tact, which is that one of the big issues that we face is that there is zero regulation on the internet and social media. There's something called Section 230, which was passed is a law that states that they can't be regulated.
That's what I wanted to demolish. That was my
good. Which is insane, of course, but I think more than that, it shows you just the immense power of the money behind it. I mean, when the internet started and social media started, it was about bringing people together, and now it is about absolutely destroying each other.
Would it be the same in Europe? I mean, like in the UK with the libel laws, is there a little more protection there, or it's the same?
Not with the internet.
Not with the internet.
Yeah. I mean, we're starting to see that. The pendulum is just starting to swing back. We see that in Australia now you have to be, I think, 16 to have a social media account. Some country today passed it, and it was 15. I noticed, and so people are starting to understand the harms. But the horse left the barn a long time ago.
Well, your conversation has opened up so many layers. We could have a few more salons on that, but let me ask something of Jody, please. Jody, in the essay that you wrote accompanying Life Between Buildings, you quoted our beloved Silvia Federici, the best philosopher of all. She says, "The very sense that we are living at the edge of a volcano makes it even more crucial to recognize that in the midst of much destruction, another world is growing, like the grass in the cracks of urban pavement, affirming our interdependence and capacity for cooperation." So in your research, this grass in the cracks of the sidewalk is both literal and metaphorical. So do you see this grass growing today still?
I forgot I quoted her in that essay. I don't know. I think I was feeling a little more optimistic when I wrote that, to be honest. I started the project, or I started becoming very interested in community gardens actually during the lockdown, because suddenly they became visible to me in a way that they hadn't as I was walking through the city. Like literally just the lack of noise, I could hear them in addition to seeing them. And I think I was really interested in her idea of re-enchanting the world and the critical potential of that, and gardens being one way of doing that. And I think a lot of the artists that are in the show us that. Sometimes literally, there's works by Cecilia Vicuña where she literally just highlighted with chalk or string grass that was growing through cracks in the pavement, and they're gorgeous. I feel like maybe the metaphor, and I was trying to get to this a little bit here, can paper over bigger problems. This is not trying to take anything away from her work and the impact it had and continues to have, or any of their work. But I do feel like I don't know, the idea of enchantment can be tricky because you can start romanticizing things in a way that makes you kind of apathetic towards larger systemic changes.
Yeah.
I think the garden is just a really tricky metaphor. It can be used in many different ways.
Fair answer. And I'm seeing Martha Stewart online right now just pushing the idea of gardening because she must have another like magazine or something. And I was also like, yeah, no, I don't think so. Anyway, let me open up to the audience. We have some time, so hands up. And I'm going to have Alex and whoever else is helping decide who gets the microphone. No questions. I have many. Okay. All right. If you don't take this, there's one here. Barbara, can always count on you. Yeah, here. And then there's Anna over there.
Is some destruction purposeful, like the destruction of Beijing during the Communist Revolution and the destruction of the antiquities in Egypt when the Muslims took over and saw them as pagan? Some of it is with a vision of the future.
Yeah.
And I wonder if people could comment on that.
Well, I guess it's for you. Yeah, it's you, definitely.
That's also a tricky question because I don't know if there are many instances of that, with the what comes next idea. Sometimes as in my the project that I did with the archaeologists, there's this weird sense of like, we can copy, preserve, and move forward at the same time. But I think that it's the instances that you point out, maybe the Marshall Plan, the post-war reconstruction of Europe, there are such instances, but wondering whether, it may start with a vision, but how far is it driven, that vision, whether it's a Chandigarh or a Brasilia, they always seem to hit the brakes somewhere.
And also, sometimes, a better future or a future, but better for who? It's some ideas of better and of future can collide. Yeah. So, Anna.
So a question for Dini and Kristen. You mentioned the misogyny and the double standard inherent in how you were treated compared to your male companion. I think we have great philosophers like Kate Mann, who wrote Entitled and Down Girl, who can help us make sense of this double standard. But I'm wondering from a PR perspective, and speaking of demolition, can we ever demolish this double standard, or do we just react to it and manage it? And what are your strategies to change it so that this doesn't have to happen again?
Welcome to what I think about every waking moment of my day. How can we change it? We have to continue to amplify women's voices loudly all the time. The misogyny right now is so bad. One of the reasons that I was very eager to work with Virginia Roberts Giuffre was because she's the main, we call them survivors, even though she's not alive anymore, of Epstein, was because her voice has today toppled institutions and rich and powerful people, and they're primarily men, with the exception of Ghislaine Maxwell. But I don't know if it's ever going to change. And I'm an optimist. They say that the thing that women are most afraid of when it comes to men is physical violence, and that what men are most afraid of when it comes to women is being shamed by them. And so I think speaking truth to power evens that out a bit.
I'm just going to add on to that too. I think I agree with everything Dini said. And one of my goals as I figure out my reconstruction is to use this platform I did not ask for, but that I have found to talk about my experience, which was in my case, was largely women attacking me. I think it was 90% online was women, and 100% of the in-person bullying was done by women. And I think what I want to keep talking about is why are we in so much pain as a gender, because I don't think we get past this if we can't come together. I think we're so much stronger together versus eating each other alive, and I see so much of that. I've seen it in my career. I saw it over this last 9 months. And so I think, the people I've spoken to that study this and that think about this have said, we just have to keep talking about it. Like, this has to be on the table as a conversation. So that's one of my goals.
Thank you. And when we were having conversations about tonight with Kristen and Dini, we were talking also about Gisèle Pellicot, a woman in France that went completely public with having been raped by dozens of men, and how powerful people like Virginia, like Kristen, like Gisèle are when it comes to changing things in the future. So, okay. Yeah.
I have a question for Christopher. When you were interviewing these people and their lives, and not just like their lives, but like this documentary we saw at the beginning, like their immaterial way of living and everything, and you interviewed them and now they're somewhere else, like, did you find that generally they wanted to go back to Hoboken, or like they were already having like rebuilt a life somewhere else, like, or like a combination? I'm curious about that idea, if some wanted to go back or not, how they saw this.
Thank you. No, there was no eagerness to particularly go back to the site of something so traumatic. But many people were eager to speak about it. It's interesting, I think the common thread between so many of the subjects that I've interviewed is they have to rely so largely sort of on their imagination, or sort of like what they can recollect, because these events are extremely traumatic. And it's like, it's so interesting that something that can be so large as hundreds and hundreds of arson fires, I don't know, there's something about the scale of that devastation that almost erases it from the mind, and you sort of have to like reconstruct it into pieces. No eagerness to return to Hoboken, but an eagerness to speak about it. Often, I would be the first person that they would ever tell these events to. They wouldn't even share it with their children or their spouses. And it's an incredible experience to sort of witness someone. I swear I've seen weight lifted off of a body in sharing something that is almost unspeakable, like your entire family burning in a building. But also sort of rekindling connections. A lot of the people that I spoke to, they didn't even know what gentrification is, right? And I would be the one to sort of fill in some of these gaps, right? And these questions that they even had, I'd come to them sort of as this sort of historian of sort, right? A tremendous experience, but no return. They stay put.
Sophia?
This question's for actually Paula. The word demolition and the group that you've assembled here today seems to look at everything through a lens of either an artistic or an anti-capitalistic lens, with the pervading sense of just regretful sanctimony, if I may. But demolition itself, in the context of construction and massive buildings, is both an exacting science and a really cool exhibit of undoing something big. Did you think of inviting somebody who does this as a profession, or because there are lots of experts in that field, to be part of the panel?
Oh, no, thank you. It's completely fair. And you know what? My salons tend to be always one-sided, but I got to tell you, we try to invite the other side, and the other side says no. I mean, you have no idea, like, desperately. In this particular case, We didn't even try to find somebody that is proud of demolition because I had an agenda, I confess. I wanted to talk about it this way because it all stemmed from the East Wing and it stemmed from the demolition that we see all around us. But I take what you're saying to heart. Thank you so much. And I am guilty as charged, so I'll do better in the future. So, one more, yeah, okay, there's, yeah, okay.
It's almost a follow-up, which is, so this notion of demolition, very masculine, the notion of large, aspirational, huge towers like downtown Brooklyn, talk about Darth Vader buildings, is very masculine and virile. And I'm sitting here thinking a lot about how do we make being imaginative and whimsical and livable. I'm thinking Jane Jacobs didn't show up here, but for Jane Jacobs, you'd have a highway running down Fifth Avenue and cutting straight through Washington Square Park so that you could get from the east side to the west side. And she was a little lady living on Jane Street who stood up and said, hell no. So I'm thinking a lot about how do we as women, sorry, but look at your panel, or others, how do we make it as sexy and virile to say no, because community gardens are cute and playgrounds are great, but what we really need is downtown Brooklyn, God help us. So if maybe as a way to sort of follow up to that question.
Who wants to take it? Jody, Francesca? Oh, I mean, it's true that we didn't talk enough about Robert Moses, but in a way I was relieved because we always talk about Robert Moses. I mean, but yeah, sorry. Yeah. Who wants to? Yeah, Jody. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I can totally answer that, but I think something I've been thinking about is this idea of like scarring. I think you said the word scarring, and I think that there's like a fantasy that you can demolish without leaving any trace of a scar, and that feels like somehow a kind of masculinist vision, or a very kind of like Trumpian vision, right? Where you can really just clean the slate. And I think one way of maybe approaching it is that we need to, not like we can't ever demolish something to build something new, but just acknowledge that whenever you do demolish something, that you're leaving some kind of scar, and what do you do with that, and how do you move forward knowing that? Yeah.
I also want to add that, maybe one can also think about, intact objects as cracking and rupturing and being under pressure. We haven't talked about that, like, something that hasn't been imploded or destroyed completely, but that it's inherently not stable. And that's the world in which demolition can make an appearance and then also become a site of making all these kinds of claims that, we've destroyed something, we've done, et cetera.
One more question from you, then the round of questions that I had, and then we can continue the question. So one more question. Sophia and Alex decide.
Hi, thank you, everybody. It's an underlying theme in what you're all talking about, but the concept of demolition and the absence of value in our society, whether it's online on the internet, there's no value for your life or you as a human being. In buildings, it's like in Japan, they raise a Frank Lloyd Wright building, and it's whether these things are necessary or it's part of a cultural thing that I'm not disregarding that, but we don't value, I think, things. And this society right now really does not value anything because it's fast fashion, it's things that are disposable.
So, to Francesca?
Yes, yeah. Francesca.
Okay. Sure. That's definitely part of it. In very economic terms, the depreciation of buildings, such that there's an obsolescence built into them, such that it doesn't make sense to keep maintaining. It makes sense to tear down and do something new. So that's definitely part of it. To go back to the point about preservation, too, that's a field grounded in values, and it's a values-based approach, and figuring out what those values are. It's not just the physical value of the building, it's the memories, the social value, cultural. I think there's a reason that preservation is rooted in that. And actually people do understand that, but that's a conversation. That's much more of a community. And when people think that in preservation is just about like architecture or, you know, or old history, something like that, I think value is a very powerful term, but it's not something that's as eye-catching as tearing down a building. And so it's a slower process, but I think that is core to thinking about other ways of countering these impulses.
Thank you. So the rapid answer, what would you like to see demolished?
Okay, I want to segue from that. I want to demolish demolition.
That's too meta.
No, but it's the spectacle, the violence. I want to demolish that way of doing things. I want things to be more thoughtful, community-oriented, slow things down. So demolish demolition.
Okay. Jody.
This is a very like how I feel today answer, but AI.
Okay, fine. Fair enough. Janti?
Certain kinds of walls.
Certain kinds of walls. I like it. Yeah. Kristen, you said that.
Jumbotrons. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, jumbotrons for sure. No, but also that law.
The one that the law that Deanie was talking about that just holds tech companies immune from any pain, whether it's suicide or anything online. They're not. Not.
Got it. Yeah.
Misogyny.
Misogyny. Okay.
This is already happening, but I hope it continues to happen. Every Christopher Columbus statue on the face.
Oh, okay. Yay. There you go. Wow, that's great. Thank you so much, you. And Alex, come on over, please. Come. So I wanted to introduce Alex to you. You'll see and you'll hear more from her in the future. Go, Alex. And now, you know, as usual, we have the mediocre wine and soggy snacks outside for everybody's delight, and we can continue speaking. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you very much.